Hi, I'm your host, Alyssa Grenfell. Before the episode begins, we have a few notes for listeners. This podcast is hosted by me and veteran attorney Tim Cosnoff, but you'll also hear other voices from our production team introducing topics and guests.
Our team produced this podcast with the mission to educate people on the issue of child abuse in the LDS community, help victims of abuse, and encourage us all to work together to help fix this issue.
We occasionally use excerpts of speeches by leaders of The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, publicly available on their website. These excerpts are used under fair use for the purposes of commentary and public interest.
If you're listening and anything you hear feels close to home, please know it should not have happened to you. You are not alone. There are people who believe you, and we can help. Episode transcripts, resources, and our contact form are available on our website, architectureofabuse.com.
This podcast contains discussions of child sexual abuse. Please listen with care.
This is Architecture of Abuse, and I'm your host, Alyssa Grenfell. Episode 1, The Problem.
This was a case that I thought was one in a million. A church knowingly facilitated putting a known child molester in the home with young children and then lying to my client's parents about what they knew. I thought, this has to be such a rare occurrence.
This steadfast belief in forgiveness and redemption, where a person like Frank Curtis was able to return. The parents in the ward had no idea.
What's the kind of boots-on-the-ground impact of a belief like this?
Do you remember that movie, Field of Dreams? If you build it, they will come?
Yes.
That's what we have here.
How did I, first of all, not even know that this was such a massive problem? And second of all, how has this problem become so widespread in a culture that is so obsessed with families and togetherness and goodness and kindness and virtue? And yet, this awful truth exists.
But there were lawyers who were eventually able to break through and get the documents in the Boston Archdiocese case. That was the beginning of the end. They couldn't control it anymore because they'd lied and lied and lied about the nature of the problem, the extent of the problem, and they couldn't deny it anymore, and there were hundreds of them.
Do you think, based on what happened to the Catholic Church, do you think that the Mormon Church should face similar scrutiny?
They should, and they will eventually. I'm a single lawyer. In the last 20 years, I've handled hundreds of cases of sexual abuse in the Mormon Church.
And there were always people who would come up to me afterwards and say, I'm glad you're talking about this. I'm glad somebody said something about this. I'm glad this was made known. This ruins people's lives. Sexual abuse ruins lives. And very many of the people that I had the pleasure of getting to know have ruined lives. It's a big deal, and it has lifelong ramifications, and it's awful. And I think that is not recognized nearly enough.
My name is Lindsay Hanson-Park, and I'm one of the executive producers of the Architecture of Abuse podcast. The movie Spotlight was more than an award-winning film. It was a catalyst for global change. The impact of both the film and the true story it portrayed was undeniable. What began as a local Boston story revealed a pattern of abuse and systemic cover-up within the Catholic Church, shattering their shield of secrecy.
This is not just Boston, it's the whole country, it's the whole world.
They knew, and they let it happen. It could have been you, it could have been me, it could have been any of us.
The voices of survivors who had been ignored for decades sparked an international reckoning that forced unprecedented policy and prevention reforms, resignations, and billions of dollars of settlements. It transformed how society confronts sexual abuse within organizations and highlighted the responsibility we all have to protect the vulnerable. But despite the precedent set by Spotlight, other organizations with similarly alarming patterns of abuse and secrecy have yet to face the same level of scrutiny as a Catholic Church. One example is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly known as the Mormon Church.
Hi, I'm Eric Phillips. I'm an executive producer on the podcast. As depicted in the film Spotlight, it was very uncomfortable for faithful Catholics to confront the truth about the abuse children were experiencing right under their noses, and the systemic actions taken by their church leaders that were causing even more of that pain. What will be discussed in this podcast may create similar feelings for some of our listeners. The various statistics, stories, and crimes we relate, as well as the way the Mormon Church repeatedly chooses to respond to these crimes, will be troubling. But the team on this podcast believes that the more this information is brought to light, the more it will hopefully help victims that have been silenced in the past and prevent additional harm in the future. We hope you share that intention with us and listen with care.
Well, I'm Tim Cosnoff. I'm an attorney. Currently, I handle jointly with other law firms 17,000 clients with claims against the Boy Scouts of America. And then I continue to take on an ad hoc basis cases against the LDS Church, the Catholic Church, the Salvation Army, Jehovah's Witnesses, and generally if it's a case or a client that is of particular interest to me, I'll take that case.
I was raised in a really devout Mormon family. We would always go to church without fail every single Sunday. We were always the type of family that was sitting in the front rows. I was baptized at 8. I went to Brigham Young University. I was married in a Mormon temple. I served a Mormon mission in Denver, Colorado. When I was about 23, I started to question my faith, and as a result, ended up choosing to leave the church and leave this entire life that I had led, which was very all-encompassing. As I was raised in the Mormon church, I heard all the time about truth and how Joseph Smith sought the truth and how members also seek the truth. And I viewed myself as someone who really doggedly wanted to pursue and know truth. When I was a teacher in 9th grade in American Fork Junior High, I had to take a training about sexual assault. Just because as part of being a teacher, you're a mandated reporter. So that means that you have to be aware of the signs and know how to respond if a student comes to you to disclose something. And I remember that when I went through that training, I heard some of the most disgusting statistics that I had no idea were such a huge problem. I remember realizing that this was a truth that I was never informed of, but that seemed huge, seemed like a really big deal. And I had just finished a 4-year education degree, and I had never heard these statistics. And I remember thinking, how did I, first of all, not even know that this was such a massive problem? And second of all, how has this problem become so widespread in a culture that is so obsessed with families and togetherness and goodness and kindness and virtue? And yet, this awful truth exists.
According to newly released FBI crime data from 2024 and the Utah State Legislature, 1 in 7 children will experience sexual abuse in the state of Utah. It is also estimated that a staggering 88% of sexual abuse cases are never reported, meaning for every one we know about, there may be 9 others we don't. 35% of victims report they were abused before the age of 10, and in 90% of cases, the abuser is someone the victims knew. This is not a few bad apples, and this is not stranger danger. This is abuse happening behind closed doors in places where children should feel safe.
As I was going through this training and then the next day going into the classroom and looking out across my students and realizing just how many of them, statistically speaking, would have had this happen to them, just from a purely mathematical perspective, the likelihood that some of these students had this happen to them, it really shook me to my core. And it made me realize that I had this other new thing of realizing that child sexual assault was worse in Utah. And there was something in the culture of Utah that was making it worse for children to grow up here. And that for children to grow up here was more dangerous than in other parts of the country.
How extensive is the problem in Utah? The church knows. I think church leaders believed erroneously that these were isolated occurrences, that it wasn't a systematic problem. They now know, as a result of all the claims that have come forward, their experience in the Boy Scout case and so forth, they've got a serious problem here, and they can't just be dismissive about it any longer. And they have to deal with it in a responsible way, not just because that's the moral thing to do, But if they fail to do that, it's just going to be a never-ending cavalcade of lawsuits and embarrassing headlines and, messes that never should have happened in the first place.
Based on what you know of how the church handles these kinds of cases, how do you think they're doing?
I'm a single lawyer. In the last 20 years, I've handled hundreds of cases of sexual abuse in the Mormon Church. And I'm talking about hundreds of perpetrators. Is that just a few bad apples? But you know who knows whether there's a few bad apples or a lot of bad apples? The church. Why? Because they land on their step.
As a new teacher, I became aware of the troubling statistics around child abuse in Utah. But after speaking with Tim and the many experts we interviewed, it became clear that the history, culture, and influence of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are deeply intertwined with the fabric of Utah's institutions. In many cases, the church's structure and authority create conditions where children are placed in vulnerable situations, often with adults they and their parents have been taught to trust. Let's begin with Tim's story, which offers a foundation of understanding how these dynamics unfold. How did you decide to take on cases that involved the LDS Church?
So after law school, I was hired by the Public Defender's Office in Chicago, Cook County, and did that for several years. I did a foray as a prosecutor after I moved to Washington State in 1988. And eventually I got a call from a 17-year-old man named Jeremiah Scott, who came into my office and told me this story about how he'd been abused by a high priest in the Mormon Church, and that the Mormon bishop had known about the proclivities of this abuser, Frank Curtis. But during the course of that investigation, there were a number of other victims of Curtis who came forward and contacted me. And that became what we called Curtis 2. And eventually we filed suit and eventually settled with another 15 Curtis victims in the Portland area. It led me on this path that I've been on since 1996.
We're going to take a moment to look at the case against Frank Curtis. You'll hear from journalist Lisa Davis, author of The Sins of Brother Curtis. Lisa's book is a deep dive investigation into Curtis's life and his decades of abuse, over 20 victims across 65 years, and the institutional failures that allowed him to continue. This case highlights not only how these crimes happen and how they're concealed, but it also reveals the broader patterns of how the LDS Church responds to and handles cases like this. It's a foundational story, one that sets the stage for everything we'll explore in episodes to come.
Well, in some ways, I often think this story picked me more than I picked it. The origin of this really goes back to a time in the mid-90s when I was a reporter in Phoenix, Arizona. And at that time, I did a lengthy piece on child sex abuse in the Mormon Church. I'm not looking at cases where an abuser happens to be Mormon. I'm looking at cases where the church actually played a role in some way. So there hadn't been really a lot of stories about that kind of thing at that time. And so when you do that, you start hearing from people forever. And honestly, I'm not sure exactly how it first came across my radar, but it would not be unusual for me to be contacted about a case involving child sex abuse in the Mormon Church after that story. So there's two stories here. One is the story of Frank Curtis, who was a serial manipulator and criminal child sex abuser. If I remember correctly, I had placed him abusing children for about 65 years in various places. Some of those years he was incarcerated, so that's it wasn't consistent. But anyway, so he had this fascinating, awful life. So that's one part of the story. And the other part of the story was this court case.
I think it was 1995. Jeremiah came into my office, and my co-counsel and I reached out to the church and their church's lawyers to see if they would be interested in resolving the case by way of settlement. And they were dismissive, and so we filed a lawsuit in 1996, and it went on for 5 years. That is an entire story in and of itself.
I thought the case itself was a story. This was Tim Kosnoff's first abuse case. That in itself was really interesting to me, is that it was kind of on a whim. He and Joel Salmi, his office mate at the time, just decided to do this case. He had been a criminal defense lawyer. This was never in his background. And so they kind of stumbled into this giant thing.
When he first came into your office, did you know how wealthy the church was or the lawyers it potentially had, or how did you go into beginning to defend him?
Well, I wouldn't say defend him, champion him.
Yeah.
Because when Jeremiah came in, looking back on it, I saw it as a professional lifeline and a personal lifeline, because this was a case that I thought was 1 in a million. A church knowingly facilitated putting a known child molester in the home with young children and then lying to my client's parents about what they knew. I thought this has to be such a rare occurrence.
And there was a certain legal adventure aspect of this, if you will, that I found really an interesting story. The idea that what started out with these two lawyers deciding, you know what, we're going to take this on. Zero idea what they were getting into, and ending up in a giant case against the very large LDS church.
But in August of 2001, after a very difficult 3-day mediation, the case settled for $3 million, which was the largest reported settlement of a child sexual abuse case in the country.
So those were this kind of two stories that were going on simultaneously in the book. So it wasn't until the 1980s that he actually first found the Mormon Church. And if you're a serial manipulator, which Frank Curtis was, this was a good deal for you, because he didn't have money, he didn't have family, he didn't have a lot going on. And so here's this community. And this community is very welcoming, offers him a sense of fellowship, connects him with other people. And that's where the first group of kids that I wrote about happens in this Portland neighborhood.
The trust, fellowship, and strong community values that Lisa Davis described are hallmarks of the LDS Church, but are unfortunately exactly what people like Frank Curtis can exploit.
It's not exclusive to the Mormon Church. It's the reason that there are sex abuse cases in other churches, as well as the Mormon Church, and also in organizations like Boy Scouts and various other places. Here's a couple of things that are problematic for the church. You know, this idea of trust on an everyday sort of local level. The ward community has this sort of shared bond, which is this belief system that they all share in the way that they're all going to live, and it's this sort of moral code that we've all agreed to, and that provides them with this sense of fellowship and community. But it also can lead to a situation where people trust members of their ward in a way that they would never trust somebody outside the ward. And that's this kind of false sense of trust that allows somebody who happens to be a member of the ward access, and an absence of scrutiny that maybe you would feel differently if they weren't part of that membership.
A ward is another place where there is enough commitment and energy to form a sort of safety net family for each of us when our families cannot or do not provide all of the teaching and growing experiences we need to return to Heavenly Father.
So that's kind of on the smaller level. And then on the medium level, if you will, the practice in the church, and people are taught to turn to their bishop for whatever problem they're having to help them handle everything from, eviction to finding a place to care for an elderly parent to, special needs with their kids. Whatever's going on in their life, the bishop is the guy. That's who they turn to.
Should there be anything amiss in your life, there is open to you a way out. Talk with your bishop. Whatever the problem, it can be worked out.
And this is a lay ministry. Bishops very frequently have full-time jobs. They have families of their own. They have volunteered to be in this position for a lot of people. And at the same time, they had no idea how to deal with child molester. They've never encountered a child molester. They know nothing about this. They know nothing about this situation. And it's, suddenly somebody's turning to them because their church member abused, their kid, and they have zero idea what to do about it or how to handle it. And so So that's kind of the middle part of this, right? And then the larger part of this is the bigger church landscape. And the bigger church landscape is the religion itself creating challenges for dealing with child molesters. And that's really where I really thought the Scott case was interesting, because this steadfast belief in forgiveness and redemption, where a person like Frank Curtis was able to return and to be in positions of trust. And the parents in the ward had no idea.
What will protect you from the sin and evil around you? I maintain that a strong testimony of our Savior and of his gospel will help see you through to safety.
And of course, Frank Curtis he's a con man. He's a lifelong criminal. He knows how to manipulate the system wherever he is. So he learned very quickly how to exploit everything about the church community. First of all, he's in his 70s. Here's this older gentleman who doesn't have family, and he doesn't really have anybody to take care of him. And so the church community, of course, wants to help him. And so that leads to invitations into people's homes for dinner. It leads to, in several cases, inviting him to come live with the family. And Frank's, whatever you need, he's your guy, right? So if you are a parent who is busy, overwhelmed, needs help with the kids, he's your babysitter. He's able to handle the kids, and he likes to hang out with them. So all three of those things, it's all three of those levels, right? So it's the trust on the small level, and it's the belief system on the large level that really made this situation happen.
And speaking to your background, what do you think about your experience as a lawyer and your expertise made you so prepared to take on these cases?
Well, I have to laugh because I was completely unprepared. I had never handled a civil case before. I was a criminal lawyer, and it's a whole different set of rules and practice. So what being a criminal lawyer trained me to do was, if you want to represent your client, you have to get out and do your own investigation, your own gumshoeing. But what I learned prepared me well for representing child sexual abuse survivors against these entities, particularly the ones like the Mormon Church, who are very adept at keeping secrets and will do anything to keep the truth from falling into the hands of the wrong people like me.
How did this coincide with the Catholic stories and news, of the Catholic bishops?
Sure. Jeremiah Scott's case was litigated for almost 5 years, from 96. And then in August of 2001, the case settled. It made headlines and newspaper articles, and it went national. And this was the start of the internet age, so people could get access to this information. As it would happen, 6 months later, in February, the Boston Archdiocese Catholic Church case exploded. The spotlight story. Judge Constance Sweeney of the Superior Court in Boston entered an order directing the Boston Archdiocese to release its priest pedophile files, the secret files it had been keeping on priests that it had known about. Hundreds of priest pedophile files held by the Archdiocese that demonstrated beyond doubt that they had known about the extent of the problem and had been lying about it. The Boston Globe put it up on their website so everybody could see it, and it went worldwide. Almost overnight, I was inundated with calls because I was the only lawyer out there, at least in my area, there were just a handful of us around the country that were concentrated in or specialized in child sexual abuse cases. Because after the Scott case, I had just said, I'm not going to do criminal law. I'm not going to do any other cases. I'm just going to do these kinds of cases. And I had more cases in a month or 6 weeks than I could possibly handle. So I began reaching out to some larger law firms to fight the ground war that I knew was coming against the Seattle Archdiocese, the Yakima Diocese, the Spokane Diocese, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits of the Pacific Northwest. So I continued to handle LDS cases. I handled what became hundreds and then thousands of cases involving different dioceses and orders of the Catholic Church. I can't tell you much about what happened to me between 2001 and 2011 because it's all such a blur.
If you could just give us a brief rundown of the history of the Catholic Church and the allegations against them of child sexual abuse.
Certainly. The Catholic Church crisis probably began as early as the 1980s. And the Catholic Church in the United States, through the policies of the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, did everything they could to keep it under wraps. But there were lawyers who were hired by survivors who overcame adverse laws and courts and were eventually able to break through and get the documents in the Boston Archdiocese case in February of 2002. And that was the beginning of the end. They couldn't control it anymore because they'd lied and lied and lied about the nature of the problem, the extent of the problem, and it documented the pattern and practice, which is they'd learn that this priest was abusing children, and they'd just go into damage control. They'd move the priest to a different parish, and because of the nature of the obsession, the compulsion of pedophilia, it would begin again. And then they do it again, and then they do it again.
Do you think, based on what happened to the Catholic Church, do you think that the Mormon Church should face similar scrutiny?
They should, and they will eventually. But the key there was the documents, because up until that time, Catholics didn't believe it. And the victims who knew, as victims do, believe that they were the only ones. But when you realize that you were part of a much larger group of people who were victimized, not by a particular priest per se, but by an entire system, then almost overnight, abuse victims in the Catholic Church started coming out in dioceses all over the country.
Remember, this is something Lisa Davis mentioned earlier about when she published her article on sex abuse in the Mormon Church. This is a theme we heard from many of our experts. When one person talks, it creates space for others to come forward too.
A lot of folks commented and reached out and said, yes, it happened to me. Yes, it's happened in another situation. Yes, all of those things happened. I did a very short book tour, but I spoke in Portland and I spoke in Phoenix and I spoke in Sacramento and a couple of other places. And there were always people who would come up to me afterwards and say, I'm glad you're talking about this. I'm glad somebody said something about this. I'm glad this was made known.
Then it just snowballed, and then it went international, and the media jumped on it, and there was extensive coverage.
Yeah, I feel like we've definitely seen how with the Mormon Church, when a single whistleblower came forward about the church's investments, even with the amount of documentation he was able to leak as part of being a whistleblower in that case, every major news outlet, the Washington Post, the Times, the New Yorker, you name the massive news organization, and they reported on the story. It goes a long way in proving not just to the critics, but to the membership as well, that there is a legitimate problem.
And when we were talking about the priest files in the church case, which lawyers were able to get, and I was able to get in my church cases against the Catholic Church, we've never been able to get those against the Mormon Church, but we know they exist. They fight and claw to prevent us from discovering that, and they've been successful in arguing that the documenting of their church court proceeding in these documents is also privileged and therefore not discoverable by lawyers. So that really is, in my mind, aside from getting documents demonstrating the asset value of all the holdings of the LDS Church, which is the secret of secrets. The second one is this compilation of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of documents, which are not all about child sexual abuse. They could be other things for which the person received church court discipline, but we know that they are maintained in our central repository that the church keeps. In the LDS case we had, the Jeremiah Scott case in Portland, we wanted all of them. And the church said, no, they shouldn't. These are protected. And they said, well, the state of Oregon then. It said, no, that's too wide. Okay, Portland. So we ended up getting those in discovery. And at the conclusion of that case, we were compelled to return them. But I got to see the form. It was a pre-printed form that the church distributed to wards and stakes around the country, around the world, with instructions on how to complete them and what to do with them. Interestingly, for a while, a copy was retained by the ward or stake, and the original was to be transmitted by mail. Now it's all done electronically to church headquarters. Now nothing should be retained at the ward or stake level. Everything should go to church headquarters. So that's an important part of their system.
I think the institution's defense mechanisms kick in. And once that happens, I've seen them lose sight of the victims. And I think they would probably disagree with that statement, but it's been my observation that there's so much attention paid to defending the institution that the victims get lost in that.
And one motion hearing, shortly near the end of the case, he was arguing that the case should be thrown out on First Amendment grounds because it was based upon the church's belief system. And a court cannot decide a case or even hear a case that is premised upon a jury evaluating a religious belief system. And we're saying, we don't care what you believe. It's like, this is what you did here, covering up and hiding Frank Curtis. This takes us back to United States v. Murphy, the polygamy prosecution, and so forth. Was it a truly held belief? Yes. Polygamy was it was an honestly, truly held belief. They truly believed it. It was part of the religious belief system of the organization. Supreme Court said, well, that's fine. We agree. You can believe whatever you want to believe, but you're engaging in these practices which violate the general law of the land. And, it prevents Jews, ancient Jews believed in polygamy, and, modern day Muslims in parts of the world practice polygamy. It's illegal in this country. And if you do it, you're subject to the criminal laws and you can go to prison. So again, you can believe whatever you want to believe.
And this is where I thought this was unique from other similar abuse cases. In the Mormon faith, the idea of forgiveness and redemption is very important. And moving that into a legal sphere in a defense way really ends up being that if you have been through this process of redemption, which Frank Curtis had, and he had been disciplined by the church, and he had been excommunicated multiple times, then he went through a spiritual growth process and ultimately was rebaptized into the church. Well, when that happens, there's this idea of and belief in a clean slate. So the argument then is we cannot consider what he's done in the past prior to his rebaptism in moving forward. That's problematic because that's how he ends up being the Sunday school teacher, and he ends up being in people's homes, and he ends up having access to children because nobody knows.
This is a quote from the transcript speaking to how that lawyer was arguing for that point. Does a church have the right to believe a person is fully forgiven and starts life anew after rebaptism? And that rebaptism ends up creating spiritually in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints a new person. Upon hearing that, what would you say they are arguing as far as the legal ramifications of this doctrine?
Well, they argued unsuccessfully in that case, and it should be noted, they haven't trotted out that argument since in any of my cases because I think they know it's a loser and it's baseless constitutionally. But it does, I think, reflect their core belief, whether they've been successful at getting a court to accept it, that their belief in forgiveness is so warped, my word, is so expansive that no matter how vile the act committed by a child molester on a child, that the church has a right to forgive that, And that then becomes an explanation for understanding why they recycle these perpetrators back in to positions where they, again, serve up unknowing families and victims to this abuser. From a civil liability point of view, it's insane. So it's it's been a very expensive thing. They've spent in settlements and lawsuits and costs and so on and so forth. Although this may be, chump change to an organization like the Mormon Church, it's not found, as near as I can tell, in any of the religious writings of the Mormon Church. So this appears to have been made up whole cloth by the church in the Jeremiah Scott case. It was rejected by the court. But in practice, the effects of that belief continue to play out every day. I've seen nothing that suggests that they're instructing their lower clergy any differently, and that they are to treat individuals who've been brought before them as sinners, and they should be counseled.
There's a lot of emphasis. I found a lot of emphasis on saving the sinner. And there was a lot, Frank Curtis was saved a lot.
I mean, we've had cases where the perpetrator was excommunicated and then rebaptized back in less than 6 months. So, Bishop was, did you insist that he get any kind of sex offender treatment? No. Did you make any effort to determine whether he'd continue to offend after he was excommunicated? No. Did you reach out to his probation officer? No. Did you do any criminal history or background check before you made the decision to recommend him for rebaptism? No. I mean, these are the kind of questions that if you asked any other kind of defendant, a school district, a corporation, I mean, this is just like guilty. They just roll over and have to write the check because they didn't do anything. This church does nothing.
The other thing is that I think it's a combination of two things. One, there's a definitely naivete that is genuine in here, is that because people don't really move outside of their very tight-knit communities, they're not exposed to the kind of knowledge that would be helpful in these cases. And then there's also a bit of arrogance to it, which is that the idea that we can handle things regardless of what they are. We can handle the situation better than the police. We can handle the situation better than other outside agencies. And so I think it's that combination.
Because the church believes the church law is the supreme law.
We live in a world of law. We may be able to avoid or skirt laws of the land, but the laws of heaven have an irrevocable effect on us today, tomorrow, and forever.
Based on what I read and what you just shared about what it's like to have this belief, not just as something that someone once said in court, but extended over into LDS doctrine and theology in general, what's the kind of boots on the ground impact of a belief like this?
Do you remember that movie, Field of Dreams? If you build it, they will come?
Yes.
That's what we have here, in my opinion. If you build a sanctuary for pedophiles, guess who will come? Pedophiles. Because we know statistically that states that have weak laws regarding child molesters, who coddle them, who are very victim unfriendly, who have statute of limitations that are completely unfair and unrealistic, that cut off victims' rights to sue, by age 20 or age 21, they have more child molesters there. And it's interesting. I mean, I've had perpetrators in litigation where, I've asked them why they moved to that state. And they said, well, it's because the laws there are not as harsh as they are in this other state. So this isn't accidental. People are motivated and deterred by certain rules. And if your rules are permissive, you're going to have more rule violators. And that's what you have here. The only thing we don't have is accountability and the ability to prove what is demonstrably true, which is in LDS communities because of this system of tolerance, and whether it's because of it just doesn't matter what your reason is. If it's pedophile friendly, you're going to have more pedophiles, which means you're going to manufacture more victims. which is why, as a lawyer representing sex abuse victims in civil cases against the Mormon Church, this is a growth industry in this place because they keep producing victims.
Well, I think there has been a social, cultural evolution in terms of being able to talk about sex in general, and sex crimes are part of that. I mean, I work in academia, and there's still incredible numbers of young women who are raped in college, and we're not talking about that nearly enough. So the lexicon around sex crimes has come a long way, but it's still not there. I think that it's awful. You don't want to talk about something that's awful. And I think that's kind of where people go first. I think that the way it's considered is problematic. So for instance, let's go back to these situations that we were talking about. If your first call is to the police and the police come out and you talk to the police about this, and then they refer you to counseling, and then you go to that, and depending on the situation, you may or may not have an emergency room visit that's part of that. There's a process, and it's dealt with, and it's talked about because it's being dealt with. And it's, this is what happens in this case. These things happen. It's not just you. It's not weird. It's not, these things happen. But when you turn to, your religious community, and your religious community tells you not to say anything to anybody and treats it like it's something we don't talk about, then that signals you that something has happened to you. And it also signals that it's your fault. And that's a huge problem. It's a huge problem because if the message here to the oftentimes 12-year-old, 9-year-old, 13-year-old is that, okay, you have been part of something bad and we're not going to talk about it. And because this thing has happened, maybe this member of the church has to go away, or this member of the church is moved someplace else, or, something along those lines. That signals to the victim that they're part of something bad. Not that they were victimized by someone who did a bad thing to them.
There is nothing in the scriptures, there is nothing in what we publish, there is nothing in what we believe or teach that gives license to parents or anyone else to neglect or abuse or molest our own or anyone else's children.
This ruins people's lives. Sexual abuse ruins lives. And very many of the people that I had the pleasure of getting to know so that I could write about them have ruined lives that started with child sex abuse and these cases. And, it's a big deal. It's not just, oh, by the way, this thing happened to me when I was in the 6th grade. It's a big deal, and it has lifelong ramifications, and it's awful. And I think that is not recognized nearly enough.
So as an author and as a content creator, I think a core part of my videos is giving the information to anyone who wants to hear it. And a lot of it is information that I never got to hear. And even as I'm researching for videos, I'm shocked by just how often I come across information that I still haven't heard, even after all this research I've done all these years. And I think education really gives people personal power. Information gives people power. And without information, they can't act with informed consent. They can't make decisions, and they can't live in a way that allows them to even direct their own lives. And so I think part of my channel and part of the content I love to make and part of being part of this podcast is knowing that education is so vital in helping people bring personal power into their own lives.
Have confidence in your gut. Have the confidence to actually check that out, to actually take that a couple of steps further, to actually believe in the fact that you are a reasonably smart person who is picking up on something that might be real. There are a lot of people who told me after the fact that they had this sort of spidey sense that something was not right there, that there was something off about Frank Curtis, or that the situation didn't feel right. I think there's a lot of times that people really, really fear this idea of wrongful allegations. And the reality is that's like 5 to 10%, definitely not more than 10% of cases are wrongful allegations. So more often than not, if your kid tells you something that they feel is not right, or you have an observation, or you have a sense for whatever reason as a parent or, a family member or a friend that something is not right, it's probably not right. So check it out at a minimum. Take steps to protect your kids. If you are uncomfortable in this situation, ask questions, get answers. It's okay to ask questions. And I would love to see people in, even in the hierarchy church structure, be willing to seek answers that you're satisfied with.
This has been episode 1 of Architecture of Abuse. I'm your host, Alyssa Grenfell. Thank you for listening. It shouldn't take a spotlight-style story for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to become more active in protecting its membership from situations where they could fall victim to people like Frank Curtis. In our next episode, we will be learning about the troubling, systemic ways in which the LDS Church responds to child abuse cases in their organization, as well as discussing the mind-boggling amount of wealth the Church has amassed and how it contributes to the problem.
Now, they try and keep this secret, but we know there's some leaks, and there was just one fund sitting on, was it $100 billion?
And when it comes onto the helpline and what that represents, we know that this isn't just by sort of poor management or negligence. This is actually a deliberate policy.
If you'd like to discuss a potential claim, you can contact me via my website, Kosnoff.com. If you are not a survivor but still want to do something to help our community, you can make an impact. Here are some things you can do to help. If someone shares their experience with you, the most important thing you can do is listen with empathy and guide them toward professional resources for support. Support them, but let them decide what is best for them. Contact your local legislators and emphasize your support for removing the clergy penitent privilege in child sexual abuse situations. Churches need to report child abuse to those with the knowledge, training, and authority to deal with these crimes. It is the only way of breaking the chain of abuse. Urge your local legislators to support a look-back window law to give child abuse victims additional time to pursue justice and publicly identify their abusers. Cutting off child sexual abuse survivors' access to the courts at age 21 is unrealistic and wrong-headed because most survivors have not processed the trauma by that age sufficient to take that step. Thank you for listening.
This episode of Architecture of Abuse was hosted by Alyssa Grenfell and Tim Cosnoff. Executive producers are Lindsay Hansen-Park and Eric W. Phillips. Produced, edited, and mixed by Lizzie Bean. Research and fact-checking by Emily Sellers. Music by Ian Post, licensed through Artlist. Special thanks to Lisa Davis for joining us. Show notes, transcripts, and additional resources are available at architectureofabuse.com. You can follow us on all platforms at Architecture of Abuse. If this episode resonated with you, please consider leaving a review and sharing it with someone who might benefit from the conversation.
Via email, we asked the LDS Church for comment, and although we didn't get a response, we did inform them we would include their standard policy, that abuse of any kind is not tolerated in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.